before we started this study, this was still a concern. Faculty were uncertain, deans were uncertain, they were skeptical, and this was a challenge for online administrators. And one of the things we wanted to do is look at our very own faculty at Oregon State, because we have had over 20 years of online education, distance education at Oregon State. And this is a population that is rather rare in the country, to have this kind of long-term group of faculty that had been doing online learning for so very long. And we found very little research existing out there on long-term online instructors' experiences, their motivations. And we thought, here's an opportunity to talk to our very own online learning experts that we have at Oregon State and try to really get an understanding of this level of expertise that they have. So that's kind of where this study started. And so our goal was to learn more about the experiences of long-term online instructors. And we defined this as instructors who had taught online for 10 years or more. And that's where we began this instructor study. And so the next thing I'm going to do is talk to you about our research objectives, although today I'm only going to show you some of the outcomes, because this was a rather large study. But the overall research objectives were to explore themes of change, risk-taking, innovation, adaptability, leadership, and how best online instructors can be supported over their life cycles of teaching online. We also wanted to identify the rationales of long-term online instructors for teaching at a distance, document the supports that long-term instructors have most valued over their careers, and note the changes in the long-term online instructor life cycle, particularly as these changes relate to their teaching practices, their course development strategies, and their professional development needs. And finally, our last research objective was to create a theory of change related to long-term online instructors' attitudes towards and beliefs about online teaching. So those objectives you will see in some of the questions that I will be showing you today. Again, we're only going to be talking about a few questions from this study, though. So the next thing I'm going to do is tell you about our study structure. So we started with a pre-survey, and so we asked folks to answer a Qualtrics survey and give us some basic information on their demographics, their level of experience with teaching online courses. We wanted to know, what other modalities did they teach in? And then we also wanted to know, we wanted to know specifically what kinds of changes they had seen over time as an online instructor. And we wanted to look at the degree of change over time of their views and beliefs on the effectiveness of online teaching and learning. And so that last bullet point there was an open-ended question. So we had them fill out a pre-survey before we scheduled interviews with them. And so this was the first stage of the process. The second stage was the interview process. And what we did with our long-term instructors who agreed to participate is 3 hour-long interviews. And this gave us the opportunity to really build rapport with these instructors. And also we structured the interview so that, we asked more detailed and more personal questions later in this interview protocol. So this was a lengthy interview protocol, as you can imagine, but here are the basic categories of the questions that we asked these instructors. So we asked about their individual origin stories for online teaching, which were a whole lot of fun to hear, how they got started. We asked about their professional development history. We asked questions about their attitudes toward and beliefs about online teaching. And we asked about perceived changes to online teaching over time. And we also asked about teaching and course development practices. And these, of course, were broken up over 3 one-hour interviews. And in most cases, these interviews happened over a period of weeks in order to kind of fit these into, the faculty schedules. In some cases, we interviewed them, and the second interview was a month later or 2 months later. So this was a rather long process. And we collected this data in the 2018-2019 academic year. And we started in August, and I think we finished in February. So it took a pretty considerable amount of time. And so I did these interviews as well as the former director of the research unit, Katie Linder. So we each kind of split these interviews. And for the most part, we did the 3 interviews as the same interviewer with that one individual. There were a few cases in which we crossed over, but that was also important in terms of that kind of rapport with the interviewees. So the next thing I'll tell you about is just a little bit about the sample or the group of faculty that we talked to that agreed to participate. So we had a total of 33 respondents. So if you multiply that by 3, that's 99 interviews. So this was a pretty big undertaking. So a little bit about those 33 respondents in terms of their online teaching. The year they started teaching online ranged from 1990 to 2010. So it was a pretty interesting range. And the average was about 2004. And their years taught online at OSU, the high was 31 years, which was pretty amazing. And the average was 14 years. So when we say these are long-term instructors, you can see just from these basic statistics, the kind of range of experience that these folks had. So a little bit about their demographics. The largest percentage, about 45%, as you might imagine, were between 55 and 64 years old, but we had a really good range. We had, about 18% in that lower range of 35 to 44 years old, and we had about 11% in the 75 plus category. So it was a pretty good range of ages in this group. And in terms of demographics, we had about 59% were female, 41% were male, and that overrepresents females slightly. When we looked at the population that we drew from, they were slightly more female than male, but this sample was slightly skewed toward female. And their current position when we were interviewing them, 67% were full-time instructors. And 20% were part-time, 13% were other, and those were retired faculty members, emeritus professors that we talked to who had been recently teaching. Now, here's my favorite set of statistics from our study. As I mentioned, 99 interviews. And so we did these interviews over Zoom. They were all remote, and so we had the audio files transcribed, and so we had 3,419 minutes of audio, which translated into 1,035 pages of transcripts. So we have a lot of data, to say the very least. So let me pause there. Are there any questions about our methodology up to this point? All right. Any questions? No? All right. So let me tell you a little bit about what we did with all of this data, since we had a lot of qualitative data to work with. So one of the resources that we found to be really, really helpful in our qualitative analysis was this book called The Coding Manual for Qualitative Researchers. So I highly recommend it if you're looking to get into qualitative research, or if you're already doing it, it's a great resource. So our team at the time was 3. So I mentioned Katie Linder, my colleague Becca Thomas is our postdoc, and I'm going to share some of her analysis with you today. The 3 of us did some pre-coding, and that involved us sitting and reading all of these transcripts and thinking about, what themes were coming out, what ideas were coming out of these interviews, and what we wanted to tackle first. So we created a coding strategy for the projects that we initially chose. Then we went off and did individual analysis of the questions, and then we paired up and double coded each of the set of questions, and we discussed to come to 100% agreement in terms of how we coded each of our projects. And then we are in the process of writing up results currently. So that's just a little overview of what we did for our qualitative process. And so today I'm going to talk to you about two of our initial projects that we have dug into and done some pretty extensive analysis. And we can show you the results from those two projects. And as I said, with a study this size, 3 interviews, 60 minutes each, all those pages of transcripts, we decided to pick our priority projects and dig into those. And then, we're constantly going back and picking new questions to analyze and expanding on the project. So let me start with an overview here of our initial projects. And these are the 2 projects that I'm going to share with you this morning. The 2 projects are faculty perceptions of skills for instructors and faculty perceptions of skills for students in the online environment. And the second project I'm going to talk about today is faculty perceptions of the future of online learning, which is a really interesting question. So in the first project that I'm going to talk about, there were 2 interview questions. Let's start there with that one. So project 1, this was our faculty perceptions of skills for instructors and students. And here are the questions on the screen. So the questions were, what skills do you think are most valuable for online instructors to have? And the second one that is similar is, what skills do students need to be able to succeed in online classrooms? And we decided that these 2 would be interesting to analyze kind of together, in that there was quite a bit of overlap. And it's interesting to see what these long-term instructors had to say in terms of their understanding of what they think was valuable from the instructor point of view and from the student point of view. So the deepest analysis that we've done so far is on the instructor side. So I have a little more data on the instructor side today than on the student side, but I'm going to give you a little overview of both of those overall questions specifically. So starting now with online instructors and this question of what are the most valuable skills for online instructors. Here is a table that shows the 5 or 6 major themes that came out in this question. And on the right-hand column, it's the percentage of instructors that mentioned something that we coded in each of these areas. So the codes are on the left and the percent of instructors are on the right. And so we're looking at things like communication, organization, time management, technology skills, flexibility, and creativity. And those of you who are online instructors out there probably are nodding your heads. At least I hope you are, because we've gotten a lot of feedback that, yeah, this is exactly what I would have said in these cases. So overwhelmingly, you see in the percentages here, communication. So communication was the overwhelming theme of the responses to this question. With the vast majority at 85% of them mentioning something related to communication. So I'm going to go into that in a little bit of detail, and then I'll just give you the highlights from each of the other 5 codes that we found, because organization and time management were tied up there for second in terms of the most frequent codes. So let me give you a little more detail about each of these and what the instructors had to say. And what these codes were. So let's look particularly at that top level code of communication. So these instructors had a lot to say and had a lot of comments in this question about specifically effective written communication. That was really the most frequent kind of sub-theme that we found in this question under this heading of communication. Is faculty emphasize being very clear, making sure that you have coherent, detailed, careful, thoughtful written communication. And those words came up in many cases in many different quotes that we have. So they felt that really, because of the online platform and what it required, effective written communication was essential as a skill for an online instructor to have. So that one was the big kind of subcode. The other two were also pretty significant, and that was responsiveness, and the other one is tone or voice. And so I'll talk about each one of those specifically. These were subcodes under communication. Under responsiveness, and I'll show you some quotes in a minute, faculty here really emphasized that they needed to be very responsive, responding to their online students in a timely manner and having very frequent communication. The other subcode here, tone or voice, is easily summarized by the bullet point that I have here, is they emphasized the how, right? So it's the how of the communication. And it's really important, according to these instructors, to consider how you are communicating and being very intentional in terms of your tone or the voice that you use in communicating with those online students. So I'm going to come back to that kind of effective written communication a little bit later, but I want to show you a couple of the quotes under responsiveness and tone or voice in the next slide, so you can get a sense of what these participants were saying. So the quote on the left is from the responsiveness code, and so I'll just read this. This instructor said they needed to be able to spend, so speaking of, what do online instructors need to do? They need to be able to spend a lot of time communicating with students via electronic means they have. You will be doing a lot of online interaction, and they have to be willing to do that. And on the right, here's an example quote for this tone or voice theme. So it's almost conversational is what I figured out worked best, and not sounding so much as an academic writer, but someone that is in conversation with them about these things. And under this heading of tone or voice, participants talked about being very intentional about putting in warm and caring tones in their emails, and talked about how, you've got to think about this and be very intentional in doing so. So that was really very interesting. All right, so now I'm going to go into some of the other codes, the top other two, or tied for 2 and 3. Most valuable skills for instructors were organization and time management, and that was each 45% of the faculty mentioned these. So organization, you may not be surprised that that would be a skill that these instructors would bring up. They specifically spent, most of the mentions of organization were specifically about the course material and making sure that they were organizing their material so it was self-explanatory, very clear, very understandable for students. And they, again, emphasized this was extremely important, especially in online courses in which you didn't have that face-to-face opportunity to clarify. However, there were others that actually talked about organization in terms of course design. So it was both. It was course design, organization, and also some folks talked about being organized in their own teaching practices as well. So it crossed both of those areas. Time management, very important theme as well. It was interesting when we looked at mentions of time management, and there was 2 kind of categories of time management here. Faculty talked about the importance of managing their time in terms of teaching the online course and the time that they spent responding to students, the time that they spent in grading, and being very careful in terms of how they manage that time. And in some cases, they talked about how this might be different than how you would manage your time because you go to a classroom every day or every other day for 90 minutes or an hour, and how time management was different in an online course because you didn't have those dedicated times during the week. And then the other theme that's on this slide is technology skills, which you would imagine is important, obviously, in an online environment. Faculty under this theme talked about being comfortable, having familiarity with online course tools, of course, and that might go without saying, but another interesting part of what they talked about with technology skills is being able to be comfortable with those skills yourself as an instructor and then being able to instruct students and to support students in the technology. And that was another piece of what kind of came up in this theme of technology skills. So 2 more areas in terms of most valuable skills. And those were the last 2 codes that I mentioned, which were flexibility and creativity. And this was a smaller percentage of faculty that mentioned these, but they're worth looking at, I think. Faculty who mentioned flexibility talked about being flexible in their teaching. They talked about being flexible and being willing to change the course design or class materials if they needed to, going back to that clarity and understandable point from the other theme. And they also really talked about online students as being a distinct population, and that they needed to be, in some cases, more flexible for online students because of their specific needs. And so that came out in this theme of flexibility. And then the last one was creativity, and that was fun to see that come out as a theme. These instructors talked about being creative in their course materials, being creative in choosing technology or using technology in their pedagogy, and experimenting and exploring new ideas about teaching. And so it was great to see that come out in terms of this kind of question of skills for online instructors. So let me take a pause here and see if there's any questions at this point.
We're good for now.
Okay, good, great. So I mentioned that this was, of course, from the instructor side. Now I want to do a little comparison from the student side. And remember, the question was, what were the skills that are important for online students to have? And the preliminary analysis of that question for students was really interesting because, as I mentioned, there was some overlap. And so in this slide, you see on the left, some of those skills for instructors, so communication, organization, time management, technology, flexibility. Notice some of those same themes, of course, came up when they talked about what are the important skills for students to have. And so just as faculty talked about their skills and being able to effectively communicate, they also talked about how the skills for students are very important in terms of how students communicate with faculty, how students communicate with others in the course. And so that was the kind of differentiator, is that it was effective communication with the instructors, but also effective communications with other classmates. They also talked about confidence in communication for students to kind of develop a confident kind of mode of communication. Time management obviously was very important, as it is for faculty. Faculty said, of course, this was very important for students. A couple of other themes that came out that were different, of course, that faculty mentioned is students reaching out for help. They thought that was an essential skill, particularly for students in an online environment, to be reaching out for help sooner than later, to reach out to their faculty members for help, or to TAs or whomever they needed to get help from. They also mentioned students being self-directed, which was also specifically related to the online environment, because, again, they mentioned that students aren't going to the classroom necessarily every other day for an hour, and so structuring their time was really important, and being directed in their time was really important. And then the reading and writing theme was interesting in terms of skills for students. And this was specifically faculty mentioning students reading and writing skills in terms of their academics. So academic reading and writing, and how those skills need to be honed and very strong for students in an online environment. And then, of course, technology, and that you see that overlap with what we mentioned earlier in terms of technology skills. Faculty were saying they needed skills in technology to be able to translate and share that with their students. And so therefore, that came up as a skill for students, that they needed to be comfortable with technology. So that's a little comparison. And now I have some quotes to kind of illustrate this top level. Again, communication was the top level theme here. And so the next slides are some quotes from the instructors on instructor communication and on student communication. So I'll take a look at those. So skills for instructors, communication theme here. Here are 2 quotes. So the one on the left, the importance of communication and to become an outstanding communicator with your students. You have to learn how to do it well, and how you do it so much. And I like that quote because I think it captures a whole lot of the analysis that we did in the kind of communication theme. And then the one on the right, good communication. That means a lot of different things. So being able to answer questions, being open to different interpretations of your words, so you can make communications or expectations clear. Also a really good quote. So in terms of what the faculty said for students and skills and related to communication, here are a couple of quotes. The one on the left, good communication skills and writing are always useful, definitely because we're not speaking to each other. We're communicating by text all the time. So again, alluding to the kind of communication happening online. And the one on the right, they have to be good communicators. They have to, because discussing online, analyzing texts online, and being able to write and express their thoughts is very essential. And communicate with others and being involved in discussion projects and peer reviews. Again, I really like that quote because it shows the totality and the emphasis on communication in so many ways that, faculty are saying students need to really master and be involved in. So a couple of really great quotes there. So that's the first project. And so next I'm going to go on to the future project, which is was our second project. So I'll just pause there and see if there's any questions about that first project.
Nope, we're good.
Okay, good. So this is the second project. So I took the lead on the skills project, and my colleague Becca did the double coding and helped with the analysis. My colleague Becca Thomas did the first pass analysis on this question. So this question, what do you think is the future of online learning? It was a really fun question that we had at the very end of our 3 one-hour interviews. As we kind of ended this set of interviews, we kind of wanted to do this kind of future look or this forward look. And we thought this group of instructors would be really interesting in terms of their insights, especially with this kind of broad base of experience and folks who had, started online learning when online learning was literally some web pages. So this was a really fun kind of way to end this interview series. And we took this on as a project to analyze. And then, of course, we have been looking at this during the spring when, we're in the middle of COVID. And, there's a whole lot of questions right now about online learning and the future of online learning. So again, bringing another kind of lens to this. But we're going to focus today on this analysis. And we did 2 levels of analysis on this question that I think you might find to be interesting. So the first slide I have for this study is our coding first round. And as I mentioned, we had 2 different rounds of codes here. So excuse me, let me take a little drink. So this slide contains the most frequent codes that we found in our first coding round. And in the right-hand column, you'll see that, again, the number of instructors. So unlike the skills question where we had this kind of overwhelming kind of whopping theme of communication, this question, we didn't have those really heavily described themes, but we did have one, which at 67%. 22 of the instructors mentioned this concept of online learning continuing to grow. And again, remember, this was a question we asked them in 2018-2019 school year. So it certainly is growing today, and we know for many interesting reasons. Also, online learning will increase access and accessibility. Over half of them talked about this concept. Now, the next 2 themes were really interesting. The conversations that we had with faculty in terms of the future of online learning contained some, I wouldn't say contradiction, but I would say kind of dual-edged responses, where some of the faculty talked about online learning might replace brick and mortar institutions or face-to-face learning, and that online learning won't replace brick and mortar or face-to-face kind of learning. And it was interesting in looking at their responses, they often talked about their own belief versus others' beliefs in this area. So they might say something like, oh, well, you know, I've heard that people are saying that, you know, brick and mortar institutions will go away, but I don't think that's the case. And so there was kind of a duality in their responses to this question. So we decided to kind of look and include both of these as codes, even though there was some overlap. And it was interesting to see their responses from their own perspective, and then how they were reflecting responses that they had heard their colleagues say or that they had heard in the environment. So those were interesting themes. And then technology development will increase was also a frequent code that we heard from these individuals. Hybrid blended learning will grow. That was an interesting piece, that these were faculty that were talking about their own experiences online, but also were really, in many cases, talking about you know, the benefits of a hybrid blended model as well. And some of them, you know, would prefer in some cases to work in a hybrid or blended environment. So that was an interesting theme. And then the last theme here is online learning will continue to be a moneymaker, was an interesting theme that only came up from 5 of the instructors, but it was worth mentioning in that they were reflecting, you know, this kind of belief or this kind of discussion out there in the online learning world about revenue and online learning driving revenue. So we wanted to include that in our analysis specifically. So the next slide, I'm going to show you some quotes that match up to some of these themes, so you can get a sense of what they were talking about in terms of the future of online learning. So online learning will increase access and accessibility. This was an interesting one to hear perspectives on. And this quote, I think, describes it pretty nicely. And this quote says, so for international students who like access to the intellectual rigor of the US university system, this online kind of experience, I think, would be really helpful. So that was one example. In terms of online learning replacing brick and mortar versus not replacing brick and mortar institutions, we found a quote that kind of illustrated both of these. And this quote says, I do hope there will always be some avenue for the face-to-face, if only for certain courses or certain skill development that really needs to get outside of what you and I are doing right here, right now. And so that's a reference to the Zoom remote interviewing we were doing. And whether it's soft skills like interpersonal communication or learning how to cook or how to cook something, you know. So that was an interesting way to kind of look at that dynamic. Technology development, I think that our online systems are going to become better at adapting to the individuality of individuals and how it is that they go about learning. So that was an interesting reflection on technology development. Hybrid blended learning will grow. This is an interesting quote in this category. I think even face-to-face are probably going to need some type of web component, just because there's so much out there, textbooks, reading materials, videos, whatever. I like to fantasize about what I would do in a face-to-face class. And I think for me, a hybrid class would be just optimal. So as I described before, you know, some of these faculty actually, you know, were wishing for a little bit more of a hybrid or blended environment. And then the last one is about the money-making theme. And this quote I found to be really interesting. So my dark future is it becomes a way to get a lot of money out of a lot of students really quickly and easily, and not have to pay so many instructors and not have to pay much and lose accountability. So that quote, excuse me, really illustrates some pessimism and some reflection on this idea of, you know, monetizing. I love the quote. I love the kind of image here of the dark future. I think that's a really kind of illustrative comment for this particular participant. So that was our first round of coding. We decided to do a second round of coding on this question. And we decided to look at a report that many of you may be familiar with, and that's called the Horizon Report. And the Horizon Report reports have been coming out for 4 or 5, maybe 6 years now. And the Horizon Report really focuses on what directions online learning is taking and what the future could potentially be for online learning. So we thought this was a great set of reports that we could use as a lens for our analysis on this question. And we were curious to see, do the themes and do the statements that our faculty were talking about, do they match up with the Horizon Report themes and categories? And so we took a look at the last 5 years of Horizon reports, so from 2015 forward, and we pulled out some of these kind of themes that were talked about in several of these reports. And so on this screen you can see 5 of them, and we didn't include them all, but we wanted to show you some of them. And I'll talk through each of these a little bit so that if you're not familiar with the Horizon reports, you'll get a basic sense of this. So one of the things from the 2019 Horizon report talked about opportunities for learners to blend their formal education with modularized online coursework. So these are things like build your own degree, stacking credentials, those kinds of things. And in the 2019 report, said this was, kind of a coming trend in the future. So 9 of our instructors actually talked about that when they talked about what was coming in the future. Another 9, also 9 of our faculty mentioned redesigning learning spaces. And this was something that showed up in the 2015 through the 2019 Horizon reports. And this was focusing on designing and evaluating spaces that facilitate active learning and collaboration. And while in the Horizon reports, this was focused in some cases on physical learning spaces, it can apply to virtual learning spaces as well. So we applied it, and faculty talked about virtual learning spaces. So we had, again, about 27% mentioning things related to designing learning spaces. Again, blended learning came up, and in the last 4 years of the Horizon reports, it was talked about as the integration of course, face-to-face and online learning. And blended learning, as we all know, is very popular today, especially. And so this is very applicable in our interviews, and it's also applicable in our current environment. And as I mentioned, and I showed you some quotes, we had several instructors kind of talk about blended learning designs in terms of the future. Rethinking how institutions work is an interesting one. And this came up in the 2015, 16, and 19 Horizon reports. And this is about higher ed institutions developing new strategies to rethink how they're fulfilling their missions and how to meet the needs of students in innovative ways or student-centered ways. And 7 of our instructors mentioned things about, kind of this institutional level and rethinking how institutions work. And then smaller number 6 mentioned collaborative learning, which was a theme in the 2017 Horizon report, excuse me. And this was about students and educators working together in peer or group activities, centering the learner, emphasizing interaction, group work, and things like that. And so that was mentioned by 9 of the instructors. So we were not necessarily surprised that our faculty weren't, or these themes didn't necessarily map with what our instructors said, but there was enough there that we thought it was relevant to kind of use that kind of top level, these top level codes and do some top down sort of coding to see how what our faculty were saying matched up with what these reports were saying about the future of online learning. So that was a fun kind of secondary analysis that we did in this study. So let me take a look at how we're doing on time. Good. All right. So.
And Mary Ellen, do you mind
yes.
if I ask a really quick question just for
Absolutely.
clarification?
This would be a great place for it.
So when you're using the term online learning here, you're referring to the online asynchronous teaching and learning, right? Not the real-time remote teaching during
Correct.
COVID. Okay.
Yes. That's a great point. Yes, absolutely. We're not talking about, you know, at eCampus, most of our online learning is asynchronous. So yeah, so that's the perspective that we're talking about. Yep, great. So here's some quotes from each of these Horizon Report themes that we mapped onto our interviews. So the modularized and disaggregated degrees, I think it's exciting because I think you should be able to do it, online learning, whenever you want, from wherever you want. You're just grabbing some education. You need to do that to do this next task, and it's not linear. Redesigning learning spaces. I think that our online systems are going to become better at adapting to the individuality of individuals, and so it is, and excuse me, and how it is they go about learning, what they pursue, and how they put the information together, and what they do with it. Blended learning designs, there's going to be more hybridization. We're going to see more and more tools, more and more flexibility, more methods where students are learning and using technology or online tools. And then rethinking how institutions work. I just have a sense that there are potential new interesting things that could happen in terms of how we do education. There's a lot of power in the way we communicate online and use the tools that, even new tools, we never thought of. And then finally, collaborative learning. Online learning opens up the world, multiple academic units, and that's a value, what you can learn from other people all over the world. So some quotes to kind of illustrate each of those themes. So I'm going to tell you what's next in terms of our analysis. So these were 2 projects. And as I said, we have a lot of data, so we have a lot of projects planned from this study. So we are going to be looking next at advice for new online instructors. And again, in the world of COVID-19, this we feel is going to be even more valuable to kind of dig into, especially this summer, so that potentially we could publish some results on our website that might be helpful for new online instructors, as we are, of course, seeing more and more online happening coming in the coming fall. Right now, Becca and I are working on faculty motivations for online teaching, so we're in the middle of analyzing that one, which is really interesting. And then, of course, we're going to look at the design and what faculty said in terms of how they design their online courses different than face-to-face courses. And so that's going to be a fun one to dig into. So if you're interested, I encourage you to go to ecampus.oregonstate.edu/online-instructors, which is a brand new page that we have just launched that is a landing page for this study. And this study we have broadened beyond just our 10-year plus. We also have interviewed faculty who've taught 1 to 2 years, and then a group in between, a faculty who taught between 3 and 9 years. And that's another set of data that we will be analyzing. So I encourage you to check our page and see what's new. I have a link to a blog post on that page on specifically that skills question that I talked about earlier. So if you're interested in more detail, you can go take a look at that. And then I will finish here, and that will give us some time for questions. I will finish with our contact information. So our main eCampus Research Unit webpage, which I gave you earlier, is listed here. Our email address and our Twitter and our RIA for the unit and for our Research in Action podcast are listed here. So I'm happy to take questions at this point.
There's a question in the chat for you right now.
Okay. Okay, so the question I have is, what research are you aware of that compares the impact of online learning versus in-person? If you mean impact in terms of like a modality comparison, if that's what your question is, we have a database for that. And as I mentioned, and I can back up to our very first slide, and I can take you there. Let's see, where was this? we go to this slide, if you look up our online learning efficacy research database, we have a database that includes, thank you for putting that in. Thank you, Cub. That it's a database that we have curated that includes the research out there that has some sort of comparison between online, face-to-face, online, or hybrid. And you can go in and look by discipline. You can look by year, and you can see the research that's out there. So it's out there. In some disciplines there's research, more research than others, but that's one place I would have you begin.
Thank you. And I think Amy has some questions generated for you. Amy, would you like to read out one to get it started?
Yes. So I had a question on you talked about written communication skills, making the writing clear, coherent, conversational versus academic. Did any of the instructors share how they learn those skills, or any tips for making sure your writing is easily understood?
Yeah, that's a really good question. In many cases, when we talk to some of these faculty, they were the first folks doing this in their departments, or they were the first folks even in their college that were doing some of this kind of online learning. So they didn't really necessarily talk about how they learned it, or did they learn it from others, but did they learn it from their own mistakes? Yes. Often they learned from trial and error, or learned in terms of, oh, this didn't go well. And I learned early on that I needed to, change the tone, or be intentional about my tone, or be, much more clear. I have a quote that talked about, even though I thought everything on my, course pages was completely understandable, students still come to me and say, this doesn't make sense, and I have to accept that, and I need to just go in and, even though I think it's completely clear, adjust to what they need. So a lot of this from this population was learning from their own experience. So that's a great question.
Gotcha. Yeah. Thank you.
And you've also mentioned instructor creativity. In the interviews, did the instructors share with you how students responded to the instructor creativity? Did they find it hard to understand creative ideas? What are you really expecting? Or they get it right away and it's just very smooth going?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So the creativity was often, talked about in terms of, teaching, pedagogical things, course design sorts of things. I'd have to go back and look at that. That's an interesting question. We could look at that very specifically, but my memory is, in most cases, these faculty were pleased by the reactions that students had to that creativity, or when they changed things up, or when they tried something new, even though in some cases they thought, okay, this is going to be scary, I don't know how this is going to go. Students often responded positively to that kind of creativity, or to that, pushing the boundary or trying something new. So there was generally pretty positive responses from that. So thanks for that question.
That's great, thank you. I think there's another question coming in from Anne in the chat.
Okay. So from Anne Wales, this research is really emphasizing the importance of communication skills, and it seems the instructors were zeroing on writing skills. Yes, that's true. I'm wondering if you see any additional research questions coming out of that. Also wonder what your thoughts are around expanding that to oral expression using different tech tools. Yeah, it was. That written communication really was an emphasis here. But there was some mention of, varying that communication, and the emphasis on, doing short videos, which has, been a practice that we've encouraged at eCampus, doing short videos. Also that question of tone, we mentioned in terms of emails, and making sure that tone is important. Faculty also talked about that tone in those short one-off videos and being personable and showing emotion. And so I think there is this aspect beyond writing. Writing was, of course, I think more dominant because I think that's the communication that most of these faculty were emphasizing, but there were elements of this kind of personal, in this case, video communication, so that oral expression, as you're mentioning. Let's see, did I answer that question? Yeah, this question of communication was really exciting in that there was such depth in just, that particular theme in and of itself. And so there is a lot more that we could explore. And we're going to look at this issue of communication across other items as well in our interview protocol. So thank you for that. So we've got a question from Joy. In terms of the technology, is there a particular technology that worked better for communication between instructors and students? We didn't ask that question specifically. So I would say no, not specifically, but many of our instructors talked about, of course, multiple ways of communicating. So, email communication, communicating in terms of email announcements, communicating in terms of, their course materials, video communication. And so the emphasis was on as much communication as possible, and then varying the type of communication. So it wasn't a particular technology specifically. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Amy, is there a different question you want to call out from the list?
Yeah, so I think this was a good question, I think, by Emily. Are there plans to revisit the study amid the broad COVID transition? Yeah, things might be a little different now.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it has, as I mentioned, changed our lens of analysis in some ways. And the things that we analyzed prior to February, and compared to the things that we're analyzing now, it's an additional lens. We are revisiting the analysis that we have already done in terms of how can we leverage what this population of experienced instructors can tell our online faculty right now, but what can they also contribute to folks who may be doing, just remote instruction, blended learning, hybrid learning. It's given us another perspective in terms of, okay, how can we use what we have in this study in multiple ways right now, in addition to being a lens in which we are going to be looking for potential themes, maybe somewhat differently as a result of where we are in education right now. So absolutely, it's a great point.
Yep, definitely a very timely study.
Yeah, in ways we didn't anticipate.
No.
Yes, and especially since we now have data from newer online instructors as well.
True.
So we have plenty of work to do. So.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm also curious, you've talked about the skills for students, and you had a list of things. Did you see the different trends in different disciplines? For example, reading and writing. Do you see that more mentioned from, for example, humanities than the sciences, or it's across the board pretty consistent?
Not, and again, we haven't done that analysis that systematically. So we did have faculty from across colleges, across disciplines, so pretty nice sample. And anecdotally, I can tell you from doing these interviews, I did not see a whole lot of difference in terms of those kinds of skills. The skills were pretty universal, depending on or regardless of who we talked to and what department they were in. So it's a great question.
Excellent. Thank you. Any other questions?
Good. I'm glad folks are finding the database. Yes. And again, that was a project we did several years ago and now has even more meaning. And we're glad to get it out there. So please share it because folks are asking for questions about, you know, blended learning right now, remote learning. So yeah, very relevant.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mary Ellen. And it's almost an hour, so
okay, great.
this is super valuable information to all of us. But before we close, I just wanted to let everyone know that Mary Ellen will be presenting another session this afternoon with 3 other instructional designers from OSU eCampus. And I just wanted to share with you in case you're interested. Emily, would you mind post that? Thank you. You've already got it. So that information is there. Amy is sharing the information in the chat, so you can take a look. We'd love to see you again in a few hours. Thank you, everyone. We'll say bye for now.
Thanks, everyone.